Hi, and welcome to the How-To Guide of edTPA Task 1 for Elementary Education. If you're watching this video, it means that you are getting prepared to submit your edTPA materials, and you might have some questions about what exactly you're supposed to be doing. So, edTPA Task 1 for Elementary Education is the Literacy Planning segment, and we have organized this into 7 simple steps for you to follow and provided examples for the steps. The first step is to select one focus class or a group of at least 4 students. So you will most likely be selecting this from your field placement, and so you will select one class that you teach or a small group of at least 4 students. The second thing that you're going to do is provide the context for learning. There is a form in your edTPA handbook that provides the guidelines and the format for you to do this context for learning, and so you can find the information there, and this includes demographic information about the school and the students. The third step is to pick a literacy standard from your school standards. If you are in a state that uses Common Core, then these will be the Common Core standards. If you are in a state that uses state-specific standards, such as Georgia, then you'll be using the Georgia standards or your respective state. And so the third step is to pick this standard. You will be most likely picking this standard with the assistance of your partner teacher. Your partner teacher probably has the whole year's instruction planned out, and so you will talk with your partner teacher and they will give you guidance in the specific standards that they would like you to teach. And so you will pick the standard and choose 3 to 5 days of consecutive lessons based on this standard.
So an example of this standard would be quote accurately from a text when reading what the text says explicitly. Just being able to read the text, I would think, and explain it when you're drawing inferences or when you have questions.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. The fourth step that you're going to need to do is to identify a central focus that includes 2 things. The first thing is an essential literacy strategy for comprehension or writing. And so you need to focus on either reading comprehension or writing.
And the example for this one is making inferences.
Yeah, so from the first standard that Emma said, the primary or central focus would be making inferences. The second thing that you need to do as part of your central focus is to identify related skills that the students will need to develop the strategy in meaningful contexts. And so what this means is that if you're, for instance, making inferences, you're going to have to teach them skills and strategies for how to find relevant information in the text for drawing these inferences. And you're supposed to do this in meaningful contexts, and so you don't want to just give them a text and have them do it. You want to pick text that the students will relate to, text that they can really understand, text that they see as relevant. And so all of these are important considerations when developing your central focus.
So our example for this step is identifying important information in a text.
The fifth step is to identify specific language demands of your lesson. These are the things that you can find in your standard that tell you what the students will need to be able to do. So, for instance, from the standard that we have selected,
it would be, quote, explain and infer. By the end of teaching this lesson, a student should be able to, quote, explain and infer.
Yeah, exactly. So you'll be able to find these in your standard, and then you just need to figure out how is the best way to get students to be able to do this. The sixth step is to write lesson plans for each lesson. These lesson plans will include 5 things, and the lesson plan format is up to you. Unlike in the math task 4 that you will be completing for edTPA, there is not a format in the edTPA handbook that will give you a lesson plan format. So your program most likely has a lesson plan format that would be suitable for edTPA, but the things that it must include are non-negotiable. You must include the state standard that you are using, and this includes the number and letter sequence that defines the standard, as well as the relevant portion of the standard. So you don't necessarily need to include the entire standard in your lesson plan if you're only talking about part of it. So, for instance, the standard that we used talks about explaining texts, but it could be a poetry text or a narrative text. And so if you're only doing poetry, then you would leave out the part about the narrative in the standard. The second thing that you have to include in your lesson plan are the learning objectives. The learning objectives are the goals that you have for your students to achieve by the end of the lesson. These are usually based on, well, they are based on your standard, but they're usually written in more student-friendly language that the students can understand.
Your school that you're a student teacher in might call these I can statements. They're the same thing.
Yes, so you could write this in different formats as well. The third thing that you have to include is your instructional strategy for differentiation. So if you have students with special learning needs, if you have English language learners in your class, you might have a variety of different learning needs in your class. And so you will have to provide instructional strategies in order to differentiate the material for these different students. The fourth thing that you have to include are formal and informal assessments. If you have a written exam that you're going to be giving the students, you'll need to include this, as well as an explanation of how you're going to assess this test. If you do informal assessments, you have to write an explanation of them. So if you are just asking them questions as a group in class, you'll need to provide an explanation of that as well.
So checking for understanding. If you're checking for understanding, anytime you check for that, write about it.
Yeah, and this could be a summative assessment or formative assessment or a more kind of casual context-based assessment that you give. The fifth and final thing that you have to include in your lesson plan are any resources and materials that you use to engage the students. Are you showing a video? You have to provide the reference for that video. Are you using specific worksheets that you've gotten from another source? You have to provide documentation and citation for all of those sources that you use. If you use the class textbook for your lesson, you will also have to cite the textbook. So any materials that you use that you do not create yourself, you will have to appropriately cite in your lesson plan. The final thing that you have to do for edTPA Task 1 in elementary education is to respond to the handbook prompts before you teach the lesson. And so it's important that you respond to these prompts before you teach the lesson, because the prompts will give you some guidance about what the best way to go about teaching the lesson is. So the handbook prompts can be found in your edTPA handbook. So look at those while you're writing your lesson, before you actually teach your lesson, and go ahead and write up your narrative response to those prompts. That is basically edTPA Task 1 for elementary education in a nutshell.
Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please refer to your edTPA handbook.